Okay, earlier I talked about the Mills bombs or the grenades. The grenades don't come ready to throw. They come in two boxes. One box has the bomb and one box has the fuses and the firing mechanism. And so what these soldiers are doing is they're taking the firing mechanisms or the fuses and they're screwing them into the grenades. Now I've told you a number of times how dangerous it was to fight for the attackers. And let's just go through some of the different risks. First of all, building collapse. The Germans would often mine buildings, and as the Canadians entered a new building, the Germans would blow up the walls and try to kill them by crushing them. Obviously, the Germans were also firing artillery, and anything like that could collapse the medieval walls of this town. Booby traps. I'm going to talk in a moment about booby traps, but these are improvised explosive devices designed to either kill one soldier or a group of soldiers. Obviously snipers. Heavy weapons like artillery guns, machine guns. We've already talked about the use of mines and using mines to create improvised explosive devices. Okay, you can see how difficult it would be for a tank to get through the scene in the photograph on this slide, and so because the infantry doesn't have the support of their tanks, they're more isolated. Okay, this picture on the left shows a grenade. You can see that the bottom part of the grenade is the explosive. Okay, this is the explosive here, and then wrapped around the explosive is the shrapnel. So these are little ball bearings. This piece up here, including the fuse, is what gets screwed into the grenade at the battle site. Okay, this is the pin. When you pull the pin, the grenade is not armed. But pulling the pin allows this safety lever to fly up, and then just like the spring on a mouse trap, there's a striker plate in the top of the fuse right here, and when the handle comes up, the striker plate hits the top of the fuse. It's got a little firing pin. The fuse then burns down, and then in usually 4.5 seconds, the fuse ignites the explosive, sending the shrapnel. So when you see a war movie and a grenade is thrown, there's usually this huge explosion. That's not the way it is at all. The explosion is nowhere near that powerful, and it's not generally the explosion that kills you, it's the fragmentation. Okay, so you can see over here this device does not look anything like the safety lever, and it's got wires. Okay, and this device too doesn't look anything like the normal firing mechanism. So these are booby trap switches. The soldiers could, instead of screwing in the normal pin and handle, they would connect the grenade to a booby trap, and then they could use the wires to, for example, put across a hallway, and then hopefully an attacker would trip the trip line and detonate the grenade. Okay, here's another type of switch. This one is designed to be buried in the ground, and you can see the detonator up here. Once these things are stepped on or depressed in some way, they trigger the switch here, which mechanically then fires the grenade. This is what the switches look like as they're delivered to the soldiers. Now, the average soldier is not going to be going around setting up booby traps. There are soldiers inside an infantry battalion called the Pioneers, and they're like Army engineers, and these are the guys that are involved in the demolitions. Not all of the booby traps were custom-made booby traps. Soldiers could improvise booby traps. This is a very easy type of booby trap. I even learned how to use this when I was in the Army. You take a tin can and you stick the grenade inside the tin can. You remove the pin, but the grenade won't fire because the tin can is holding the safety handle down. As soon as somebody crosses through the path, they pull the wire, which pulls the grenade out of the can, and that allows the safety lever to release, firing the fuse, and then eventually exploding the grenade. Now there was one event in the battle where a whole platoon of soldiers from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, so this is about 30 men, were hiding in a room in a building. The Germans had placed a tank mine inside that room, and when they saw the Canadians enter the room, they detonated the mine, killing almost everybody in the room. This soldier, Private Boyd, 3.5 days after the explosion, was dug up from the rubble alive. Now the Canadians also had some tanks. The Germans didn't have tanks. They're paratroopers. They're lightly armed, generally only with machine guns and mortars. But the Canadians did have some tank support. But we've already talked about how the tank support could be blocked by rubble from the buildings. So the tank that was used was the Sherman tank. This is an American-designed tank. It's got a 75mm gun. The German guns were generally larger than 75mm, and the German tanks generally had more armor. But as far as supporting infantry against paratroopers, the tanks did very well at Ortona. Not only did the Canadian infantry have tank support, but they also had their own anti-tank guns, which are like small artillery pieces, and they could use these to breach the walls to allow themselves to get inside the buildings. In addition, they could use the Piat. The Piat was an early type of bazooka, and it's spring-fired. So that means that rather than having a rocket like a modern anti-tank gun, like maybe you've seen an RPG on the news or in a war movie, this thing is just like a big spring-loaded toy. The spring, obviously, to be able to hurl that bomb 90 yards, the spring on it was huge. And so when a soldier fired the Piat, they say that his shoulder would hurt for days. Very difficult to load this weapon, and so somewhat effective, more against trucks than tanks, but better than nothing. You can see that if you are using a weapon that has a range of 90 yards, you have to get very close to a tank in order to be able to use it. Often they wouldn't be trying to kill the tank or to kill the people in the tank. They would just try to stop the tank from being mobile. So the weakest part of the tank is this crack between the turret and the hull. Sometimes they would try to fire it in that crack. Often they would just be trying to hit the wheels or the tracks so that the tank couldn't move. This is an example of a German MG-34 machine gun designed at the beginning of the war, actually in the 1930s. This weapon was belt-fed, and you can see the Canadian soldier with the belts of ammunition around his shoulders. This weapon could fire 900 rounds per minute, and that is a very fast rate of fire. We saw from our study of the First World War how deadly machine guns can be. When we compare the belt-fed German machine gun to the British gun, which was the Bren gun, we can see that there's a huge advantage for the Germans. The British and Canadian Bren gun was magazine-fed, and there's 30 bullets in each one of those magazines. And so you can imagine if you're firing that weapon on automatic, it wouldn't take very long to go through 30 bullets and have to reload the magazine. Now, most of the civilians in Ortona left, but many of them didn't. And because there were civilians in the area, the Germans, in some cases, were able to dress up like civilians and try to gain their own intelligence. This soldier is a German paratrooper who was captured by the Canadians in the week before the battle. Now, who were the Canadians fighting? While the Canadians didn't have a lot of experience in battle, the soldiers that they were fighting did. These were paratroopers from the 1st Parachute Division, and in the Army, the paratroopers are the cream of the crop. Okay, so when they land on the ground, they don't have all of the support that regular infantry normally have. So these guys tend to be very, very fit, very, very tough, and very, very well motivated. Paratroopers are made up of all volunteers, and they are definitely the elite of the Army, and there's no doubt that the 1st Parachute Division was a very good group of soldiers. Again, here's an evidence question. So if you're looking at this photograph, what do you see? Well, I'm hoping that you can look at the helmet of this soldier here and determine that this is a British or a Canadian soldier. If we're looking at Ortona, obviously it would be Canadian. If we look at this weapon here, I'm hoping you can see this curved magazine. So this is a Canadian Bren gun team firing from inside the window. You notice the soldier doesn't have the barrel of the weapon sticking outside the window. To do that would mean that he could be detected by the Germans much more easily, so you always have the weapon inside the window. Field Marshal Kesselring was the German commander of the Winter Line, and because of the order from Hitler, he had told his soldiers that Ortona was to be held, and as a result of this, after the Canadians started their attack, the paratroopers staged a very intense counterattack on Christmas Eve day. The Canadians were able to hold on. Now, one of the interesting stories of the Battle of Ortona is the Christmas dinner that the Seaforths were able to organize. This was the first Christmas that the soldiers had been away from England, and the quartermaster, the officer who's in charge of supplying the battalion, sent his people around the countryside, and they managed to scrounge up enough roast pork and beer and chocolate so that each of the companies could be taken out of the front line and brought back and fed a Christmas dinner. For many of these men, obviously, it was their last Christmas dinner. And one of the interesting notes about this event is that Sergeant Smoky Smith from New Westminster, he was called Smoky because he was such a fast track runner in high school, he was in charge of a Bren gun section, and when it was his section's turn to go for dinner, he looked at his men and he said, "None of you are going to this dinner. A lot of men are going to die going to this dinner, and there's no dinner that's worth dying for." And obviously his soldiers would have been very upset that they were going to miss their Christmas dinner, but of course all of them survived too. Smoky Smith later on won the Victoria Cross, which is of course the highest medal for valor in the Commonwealth. This is a scene not of the Seaforths eating their Christmas dinner. It is a scene from the next day, and these soldiers sitting at these tables were actually the support soldiers. Okay, by December 28th, the battle was mostly over. You can see here the soldiers are now passing in the street under the support of the tanks. The fighting in Ortona was intense, as we've said before, because the casualty rate was so high. I think something like almost 80% of the soldiers who fought at Ortona were killed or wounded. Morale suffered greatly. A lot of soldiers were suffering from battle shock, what we might have called shell shock in the First World War, and it prompted the Canadian general, who was the leader of the 1st Division, General Vaux, to say that everything before Ortona was a fairy tale.